Yeah. Well, so when I talk about designing conversations, I just want to put myself in context because having the perspective of an industrial design brain, one of the things they taught us early on in design school is you have to know your material. We did all this, we toured factories, and
Yeah.
you can't make glass do what steel does, right? And you cannot make steel do what glass can do. It's just, they're two
Right.
different things. And when I started thinking about what conversation design could mean almost more than 5 years ago, I was like, what is a conversation made out of? Like, what is the materiality of it? And I think this is one of the things when people say they're not good at conversation, they don't see the matrix.
Right.
They're not seeing it as a material that they can shape. It's something that happens like the ocean. It just washes over you. The 200 millisecond gap is surprisingly consistent across cultures. That I know 200 milliseconds is really short. That's a firing pistol and a sprinter sprinting. That gap is when you ask me a question, Wanda, and I wait more than 200 milliseconds, it sounds like dead air,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And if I wait more than 200 milliseconds in regular everyday life, people are like, oh my God, Daniel is so overthinking his response. Now, this is not just America. This is global average across the world and even in sign language, which is even funnier, right? Because this is human brain stuff where you're like, hey, I asked you a question. Where's my answer?
Yeah.
Right. And the joke is 600 milliseconds is about what it takes for us to formulate a reasonable response. So there's 400 milliseconds of garbage that's either me thinking of my response while you are finishing, because I can, as 40 plus years, 60 plus years as conversationalists, we can anticipate by tone when somebody's sort of finishing up and we kind of know where they're going. So we're going to guess. So I'm already starting to think about what I'm going to say. Or I do the thing where you ask me a question and
Uh-huh.
or, well, that's and so having, so if you want to talk about strategies, at least having a good phrase in your back pocket. Wanda, that's such a good question. I have a few thoughts on that,
Yeah.
right? Just to give your brain a moment to
Moment.
catch up,
All
right?
right.
So
So
that's like, and that's just built in, right?
that's right.
That's brains and culture.
All right. So 600 milliseconds around the world, even in sign language, is how long it
Yeah,
takes us to formulate an answer to a question.
yeah,
200 milliseconds is the time we expect between
yeah,
finishing the question and a response from you. 200 milliseconds. Okay.
yeah.
All right. That tells you what we're doing. And I swear, in some places, like in New York, it might be less than 200 milliseconds, just for the record.
Right. So here's the consequence of that. What people don't realize is, there's executives that you and I serve when they're having 45 hours of meetings a week. What they're doing is having 45 hours of conversations externally with other people. What they're generally not doing is protecting their internal conversation time.
Right.
Right. And when you look at that number of 600 milliseconds, well, it just takes you 600 milliseconds to think of a response to a question. Like, how long do you think it takes you to think of a strategic plan for the next quarter? Right. Having time, protecting time, designing time into your life, into your schedule. This is Paul Graham, who wrote about the
Right.
makers and managers schedule. Everyone's a maker.
Yeah.
Everyone is designing their lives. And if you look at your calendar and it doesn't represent your priorities and give you time to think, then that's on you. That's on all of
Right.
us to
Right.
design our calendars, to design our conversations to support the way our brains work so that we can be effective.